The silence before a storm is not measured in seconds, it's measured in the way a room holds its breath. And on that day, inside the bright, merciless lights of live television, a silence settled the way thunder waits on the horizon. He had spoken first. Alan Dershowitz, the Harvard lawyer who spent decades sculpting his name into the marble of American legal debates, a man both celebrated and despised, a man who had stood beside presidents and defended the indefensible. He spoke with the arrogance of tenure, with the confidence of age, with the belief that no one, least of all a first-term black congresswoman from Texas, could check him on live television. But the problem with arrogance is that it assumes silence from those who've been underestimated. And Jasmine Crockett was not built for silence. She had carried her words through courtrooms that reeked of injustice. She had carved her way into politics without permission slips from the establishment. And she had learned long before Washington that the only weapon you can count on when the odds are stacked against you is your voice. And so when Dershowitz leaned back in his chair, smirking with the casual cruelty of a man used to watching his opponents shrink, the audience waited to see her shrink too. But instead, something cracked like a match being struck in the dark. Because this wasn't just about a spat on TV, it wasn't just about insult or reputation. It was about the clash between two Americas. One that still believes pedigree and privilege can dictate who gets the last word, and one that has decided it will no longer bow its head. What did he say, exactly? The words don't matter as much as the intention behind them. It was a dismissal disguised as legal critique, a condescension wrapped in the language of expertise. It was the suggestion that she didn't know her history, didn't know the Constitution, didn't belong in the same ring as the men who had written their resume to the nation's legal DNA. It was every boardroom sneer, every academic scoff, every raised eyebrow that black women in positions of power have faced since this country's founding. But what happened next was not in the script. The camera didn't flinch, and neither did she. She adjusted her mic, her eyes narrowed not in anger but in calculation, and then she spoke. When Jasmine Crockett speaks, it is not performance, it is precision. Her training as an attorney gives her a rhythm, a pacing, a surgical ability to cut through the fog of jargon and land on the heart of the matter. And in that moment, with millions watching, she reminded Dershowitz and the country that receipts matter. She began listing them, not as bullets but as blades. Every case she had argued that dealt with constitutional rights. Every moment she had stood toe-to-toe with state legislatures that tried to erase communities from maps. Every law passed. Every precedent broken. Every scar that proved she had been in the fight longer than her critics cared to admit. And then, like a chess master flipping the board, she pulled out the one thing that no sneer can erase: the record. Voting rights gutted by the Supreme Court, districts carved to weaken minority voices, federal judges confirmed despite credible accusations of bias. She laid them out one after another, receipts that traced the fingerprints of a system Dershowitz himself had helped rationalize. And the audience leaned in because this was not supposed to happen. The narrative of American television often rewards the veteran, the established name, the one with the book deals and the lecture circuit. But on this night, that narrative cracked. Crockett didn't just respond to Dershowitz, she flipped the lens. She asked him, directly and without hesitation, what good is a constitutional scholar who only quotes the document but never confronts the harm done in its name? What good is defending process when process has been weaponized against the powerless? What good is citing law if you refuse to see who the law leaves behind? And there it was, the freeze. Dershowitz, for all his decades of legal arguments, sat still, blinking into the silence that followed. Because there is no precedent for truth delivered without apology, but to understand the power of that moment, you have to understand the path that led her there. Jasmine Crockett's rise was not built in ivory towers or wood-paneled courtrooms. It was forged in the raw heat of criminal defense, where the stakes weren't debates but lives. She spent years fighting for clients no one else wanted to touch, men and women tossed aside by a system designed to convict first and ask questions later. She knew what it was like to walk into a courtroom already judged by the color of her skin and the tilt of her voice. And she knew the language of humiliation because she had lived it. That's why when Dershowitz tried to humiliate her on air, it didn't land, it rebounded. She had already been through worse. The media loves spectacle. But what it captured that night was more than a sparring match. It was a generational handoff. Dershowitz represented an era when legal commentary was dominated by elite voices that floated above the lived realities of marginalized people. Crockett represented a new era where the law is not theory but battleground, where experience on the ground matters more than citations from the bench. And as she spoke, you could feel the balance shifting. Viewers across the country, young lawyers, activists, ordinary citizens who had never even cared about constitutional interpretation, felt something click. It was the feeling of watching someone refuse to be minimized. And here is the truth that history will record. America does not change because the powerful decide to open the door. America changes because the excluded decide to break it down. Crockett, in that moment, was not just defending herself. She was embodying a lineage from Shirley Chisholm to Barbara Jordan to Maxine, waters of women who had been told to wait their turn and had decided instead to speak out of turn. She was reminding the nation that expertise is not measured in proximity to Harvard, it is measured in proximity to the people whose lives hang in the balance of every law passed, every ruling handed down, every insult hurled to keep them in their place. The freeze on Dershowitz's face was more than embarrassment, it was recognition. Recognition that the ground beneath him was shifting, that the old strategies of dismissal and diminishment were losing their power in real time, and while pundits would later argue about whether she won the exchange, the truth is simpler. She didn't just win the argument, she changed the arena. From that day forward, every network, every hearing, every panel that tried to pit her against a so-called expert would have to reckon with the fact that she would not play the role assigned to her. She would not sit quietly while pedigree tried to silence principle. She would not flinch when challenged. And most of all, she would not let lies go unchallenged. Not when the receipts were in her hands, because receipts are more than evidence. Receipts are history. And Jasmine Crockett knows that history, when spoken aloud in the right moment, has the power to freeze even the most powerful men in their seats. Power does not collapse quietly. It cracks under pressure, and the sound echoes. After that night, the clip spread like wildfire across feeds, timelines, and news cycles. What was supposed to be another panel discussion turned into a fault line in American politics. For years, Alan Dershowitz had built his reputation on commanding the conversation, shifting the debate with technical language, and overwhelming opponents with his resume. But suddenly, his words were not the headline. The headline was the woman he had tried to belittle. Jasmine Crockett's name was no longer confined to the congressional roster. It was etched into the digital bloodstream of the nation, and for millions who had never heard her speak before, the reaction was immediate. Who is she, and how did she just dismantle him in front of everyone? The answer was not a secret. Crockett's story was already public, but moments like these sharpen. A biography into Blade. She grew up in Dallas in neighborhoods that knew firsthand what systemic neglect looked like. Public schools underfunded, healthcare scarce, opportunity hoarded for the few. She knew what it meant to watch communities survive, not because the system worked, but because they outworked the system. When she chose law, it wasn't to chase prestige, it was to build a shield for those who had none. Every case she argued wasn't about abstract legal theories. It was about lives, futures, families. That training gave her not only fluency in the law, but fluency in injustice. She could hear it in the tone of a prosecutor, see it in the quiet shrug of a judge, feel it in the desperation of clients who already knew the odds were stacked. And it was that fluency that surfaced when she faced Dershowitz. She didn't need to out-credential him. She needed only to show that the gap between theory and reality is where people either live or die. And here's the part the media almost missed. The insult wasn't just personal, it was structural. Dershowitz's tone was not born in a vacuum. It was the echo of centuries in which women, and especially black women, were expected to be the footnotes in someone else's argument. That is why the reaction to the clip was so visceral. It wasn't just viewers cheering for a sharp comeback, it was recognition. Recognition that once again, someone had tried to lock the door of legitimacy, and once again, someone had kicked. It opened. What followed was predictable in one sense and shocking in another. Predictable because critics lined up to downplay her response. They accused her of being too emotional, of lacking decorum, of making it personal. These were the same criticisms hurled at every woman who dared confront men in positions of power, criticisms designed to deflect from the substance of her argument, but shocking because the counter-narrative was louder. For every pundit who tried to dismiss her, there were thousands of voices online amplifying her. Clips were dissected in real time. Legal scholars debated the implications of her points. Activists celebrated the courage it took to call out hypocrisy live, without stumbling, without fear. The imbalance between how the establishment reacted and how ordinary people reacted became the story itself. And here lies the deeper truth. America is living in a moment of receipts. From police body cams to leaked documents, from text messages to whistleblower testimonies, truth no longer hides in dusty archives. It leaks, it uploads, it goes viral. Crockett understood this instinctively. When she said receipts, she wasn't just referencing evidence. She was invoking a culture that demands proof in the face of denial. She was speaking the language of a generation that refuses to take the powerful at their word. And that is why Dershowitz froze. Because for the first time, the argument wasn't about who could cite the most footnotes. It was about who could show the most scars. The scar she pointed to most sharply that night was the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, the Supreme Court, in Shelby County v. Holder, stripped away the preclearance requirement that forced states with histories of discrimination to seek federal approval before changing voting laws. That decision opened the floodgates. States moved quickly to pass voter ID laws, to redraw maps, to purge rolls. Millions felt the impact, though most never saw the courtroom arguments that enabled it. Dershowitz and others like him defended the decision as a matter of constitutional balance. Crockett, on the other hand, had lived the consequences. She saw the maps redrawn in Texas, where communities of color found themselves cracked and packed to weaken their political power. She saw the laws passed that disproportionately blocked access for black and brown voters. These weren't theories. They were receipts. And when she laid them out, point by point, she wasn't debating. She was indicting. Indictments, though, don't sit well with those who see themselves as untouchable. Within days, conservative outlets tried to reframe the exchange. They painted Dershowitz as a victim of a radical congresswoman. They accused her of disrespect, of grandstanding, of attacking a scholar instead of engaging ideas. But the clips didn't lie. Viewers saw the sequence: his dismissal, her response, his freeze. And what millions saw with their own eyes cannot be undone by spin. The significance of that moment grew because of timing. America in that year was already boiling with tension. The legitimacy of the Supreme Court was under scrutiny, with revelations of undisclosed gifts and questionable ethics practices swirling around justices like Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. Congress was deadlocked in partisan warfare, while state legislatures across the country were pushing laws that rolled back reproductive rights, voting rights, and LGBTQ protections. In that climate, Crockett's confrontation wasn't just an argument with a legal scholar, it was a microcosm of the larger battle. Who gets to define democracy? Who gets to interpret the Constitution? Who gets to decide whose voices count? And here's the irony that made the moment historic. Dershowitz himself had once been celebrated as a defender of civil liberties. In the 1960s and 70s, he had built his career on cases that tested the limits of government power. Yet, as decades passed, his defenses shifted, his allegiances blurred, and his legacy became entangled with figures like Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. By the time he sat across from Crockett, his reputation carried as much baggage as it did. Prestige, and Crockett's words, sharp and unflinching, cut through that baggage. She was not arguing with the Dershowitz of textbooks. She was confronting the Dershowitz of now, a man whose credibility was already fraying, but perhaps the most Profound part of her response was what it revealed about her political identity. Crockett is not content to play defense. Too often, Democrats in these arenas settle for rebuttals that are careful, cautious, hedged. She did not hedge. She attacked hypocrisy directly, and in doing so, she set a new tone. That tone, bold, unapologetic, rooted in lived reality, resonates with a generation tired of watching their representatives tiptoe around truth. The fallout was immediate. Progressive groups flooded her office with support. Young voters clipped her quotes for TikTok, turning her lines into rallying cries. Even within Congress, colleagues began to see her differently, not just as a freshman lawmaker, but as someone who could command national attention. And attention in politics is power, yet with power comes pushback. Conservative PACs began testing attack ads targeting her district. Whisper campaigns emerged, questioning her temperament, questioning her respectability, questioning whether she was fit to serve in higher roles. It was the oldest playbook in American politics. If you cannot defeat the argument, try to discredit the person. But Crockett had an advantage: authenticity. When she spoke, people could tell it wasn't rehearsed spin, it was lived truth. And that authenticity proved harder to attack than any single vote or policy stance. Here's the part the history books will note. Every generation produces a moment when someone previously underestimated breaks through the noise and forces the country to pay attention. For Crockett, this was that moment. And while detractors framed it as a clash with Dershowitz, supporters understood the deeper resonance. It was not about a single insult or a single rebuttal. It was about a shift in power, an old guard losing its grip, and a new voice refusing to stay silent. What Dershowitz did not anticipate was that silence can no longer protect power the way it once did. In the era of viral receipts, the freeze is more damning than the insult. And his freeze, replayed millions of times, became a symbol, not of his defeat but of her emergence. History has a rhythm, and if you listen closely, you can hear the echoes. Crockett's confrontation with Dershowitz did not happen in isolation. It landed inside a lineage of black women who have stepped into rooms designed to silence them and turn silence into thunder. Barbara Jordan in 1974, seated before the House Judiciary Committee during the Nixon impeachment hearings, speaking with a gravity that made the chamber fall quiet. Her words, deliberate, measured, resolute, were not just constitutional arguments. They were a declaration that the Constitution belonged to those long written out of its promises. Decades later, Anita Hill, 1991, standing alone against a Senate committee dominated by men who did not want to hear her truth. She spoke anyway, describing harassment with a clarity that pierced the air. And though the senators tried to dismiss her, millions of women watching knew exactly what she meant. Those moments, like Crockett's, were not accidents. They were ruptures, sudden breaks in the polished surface of American politics where truth spilled out raw and undeniable. When Crockett spoke back to Dershowitz, it was as if those voices were standing behind her. Jordan's insistence that no one is above the law. Hill's refusal to swallow humiliation for the sake of decorum. Shirley Chisholm's famous declaration that she was unbought and unbossed. These legacies converged in her words, and that is why they struck with such weight. The freeze on Dershowitz's face was not only his own, it was the freeze of a tradition that believed power was inherited, not contested, confronted by a new generation declaring otherwise. But unlike those earlier moments, Crockett's exchange exploded in the era of instant virality. Barbara Jordan's speech was preserved on tape, replayed on evening news broadcasts, quoted in print. Anita Hill's testimony rippled out across daytime television and print columns, debated for months. Afterward, Crockett's clip, it hit millions within hours. TikTok stitched it into memes. Twitter spun it into threads. YouTube amplified the full segment. Instagram Reels turned her sharpest line into a refrain. It was not just political junkies analyzing her tone, it was teenagers, activists, churchgoers, young professionals, even apolitical scrollers who stumbled on the clip and stopped mid-swipe. That acceleration of recognition is the unique currency of this political age. Power no longer flows solely through congressional hearings or Sunday talk shows. Power now flows through the algorithm, and Crockett had just hacked it without trying. That hack was rooted in something simple: truth delivered without apology. Too often, politicians speak as if they're auditioning for approval. They soften edges, dilute urgency, cloak arguments in bureaucratic language. Crockett did the opposite. She named what she saw, she called hypocrisy by its name, and that authenticity struck like a match in dry grass. Because America was already combustible, the public trust in institutions was crumbling. Revelations about Supreme Court justices accepting lavish gifts and failing to disclose them had shattered the illusion of impartiality. State legislatures were weaponizing gerrymandering with surgical precision, cracking black and brown communities into fragments to dilute their vote. Police violence continued to haunt cities, income inequality widened. Against that backdrop, Crockett's refusal to defer to pedigree sounded less like defiance and more like survival, and survival is political. Every generation of marginalized Americans has known it, from enslaved people who taught each other to read in secret, to women who registered voters under threat of violence, to civil rights marchers who locked arms and sang through tear gas. Survival has always been an act of resistance. Crockett's rebuttal belonged to that tradition. It was not just a clever comeback, it was survival in real time. She was refusing to let dismissal erase her. She was demanding space, not asking for it. And in that demand, millions found recognition of their own struggles in workplaces, in schools, in hospitals, in courtrooms where credentials were used not to include them but to shut them out. Of course, institutions do not yield gracefully. Within days, the narrative machine cranked into gear. Op-eds flooded in, some calling her reckless, others warning that she was setting a dangerous precedent for disrespecting elders in political discourse. The framing was predictable. She was too loud, too aggressive, too personal. But here's the thing. Every one of those labels has been weaponized against women of color in America for generations. It is a pattern so familiar that it exposes itself. And Crockett knew it. Instead of retreating, she leaned in. In interviews following the incident, she didn't soften her words. She repeated them, she expanded on them, she doubled down. And that doubling down became part of the story, a refusal to let the establishment dictate not only her tone but her legitimacy. It's important to pause here and note the stakes. This wasn't about Crockett versus Dershowitz as individuals. It was about what each represented. Dershowitz represented an old guard, the legal scholar, the courtroom celebrity, the man whose authority was assumed because it had been granted for decades. Crockett represented a new politics, one forged in community organizing, one fluent in the language of receipts, one unapologetically rooted in lived experience. Their clash was symbolic, the inheritance of authority colliding with the demand for accountability. And accountability, when demanded, always makes authority tremble. The tremors spread. Cable news began running split-screen segments. On one side, Crockett's fiery response. On the other, panels debating whether she had crossed a line. Conservative commentators clutched pearls about decorum, while progressive commentators pointed out that decorum had never been afforded to marginalized communities in the first place. Night after night, her face flashed across screens, her words replayed again and again, and each replay deepened the impact. Because repetition turns moments into movements, but let's not romanticize. The backlash was real, and it carried risks. Political opponents began circling, waiting for missteps. Right-wing influencers dug into her record, her past cases, her social media history, hoping to find ammunition. They framed her as a radical and angry black woman, a socialist plant. These attacks were not new, but their amplification in the digital era made them more dangerous. And Crockett knew the risk of becoming a caricature in someone else's narrative. That is why her response mattered even more. By staying consistent, by refusing to apologize for her tone, she seized control of the narrative. She was not the caricature. She was the challenger. And challengers shift culture. Because every time Crockett stood firm, she cracked the script of American political theater, the script where women are expected to stay calm while men interrupt, where black voices are dismissed as too emotional while white voices are framed as authoritative, where credentials outweigh lived truth. By refusing that script, she forced a rewrite. And the rewrite was happening live, in front of millions. In real time, here's the deeper resonance. Crockett's moment came during a period when democracy itself felt brittle. Across the globe, authoritarianism was rising. In the U.S., attacks on voting rights intensified, state legislatures banned books, and political violence crept closer to the mainstream. Citizens felt the fragility. Trust was collapsing not just in politicians, but in courts, in schools, in media, in the very notion of truth. In that fragile context, a single voice refusing to be dismissed felt seismic, because what she modeled was not just resistance to an insult. It was resistance to the erosion of democracy itself. If power can silence a congresswoman on live TV, what chance does the average citizen have? But if a congresswoman can refuse silence, perhaps others can too, and so the moment expanded beyond her. Community groups replayed the clip at meetings. Universities used it in classrooms. Civil rights. Lawyers cited it in speeches about the importance of challenging authority. For young black girls watching, it became evidence that they did not have to wait for permission to speak. For communities long silenced, it became proof that silence is not the only option, but power never concedes easily. The pushback grew sharper. Conservative media began framing Crockett as a media creation, suggesting that she was chasing fame rather than justice. Some even tried to pit her against older civil rights leaders, arguing that she lacked their discipline. This was a calculated move: divide the lineage, fracture the movement, discredit the continuity. Yet, once again, the receipts told a different story. Crockett herself invoked Jordan Hill, Chisholm, Maxine Waters, a lineage she claimed openly, refusing to let her detractors isolate her from history. By situating herself in that tradition, she disarmed the divide-and-conquer strategy. She wasn't trying to replace anyone. She was carrying the torch forward, and forward is where the story kept moving. Because in America, political moments don't stay static. They mutate. Crockett's exchange became a meme, then a debate, then a case study, then a movement marker, and each mutation amplified her presence. The more they tried to dismiss her, the more visible she became. The more visible she became, the harder it was to erase her. Visibility is survival. Visibility is power. Visibility is how history remembers. The truth is this: every insult carries within it an opportunity. An opportunity to expose, to reveal, to challenge. Dershowitz's insult was intended to diminish. Crockett turned it into a spotlight. That inversion, from dismissal to amplification, is the art of survival in politics. And survival, when witnessed, inspires others to survive too. That is why millions felt something shift watching her. They weren't just watching a congresswoman clap back. They were watching a blueprint for how to refuse erasure, and that blueprint will echo. Just as Jordan's calm authority echoes, just as Hill's courage echoes, just as Chisholm's defiance echoes, so too will Crockett's refusal echo. It will echo in classrooms, in courtrooms, in organizing meetings, in the quiet resolve of people who know that legitimacy is not granted, it is taken.